Good afternoon, everybody. Craig Kahlke from Cornell Cooperative Extension Lake Ontario Fruit Program. Welcome to our webinar, 10 to 13 millimeter spray recommendations, Western New York, with Dr. Terence Robinson from Cornell Agritech and Miranda Sazo from the fruit team. I am going to share my screen, a couple of introductory slides to show you. So we're going to go over the Zoom basics for newbies, today's sponsor, and then we're going to get right into it with Terence with the thinning recommendations, and it'll be Q&A for Terence and Mario. Should have plenty of time for questions. Introduce today's sponsor, Valent Biosciences. They're sponsoring this series of webinars, and we really appreciate it. This timing, they offer a number of insecticides used at this important stage in the growing season. Dipel DF is an effective BT product for the management of leaf roller pests. It can also strengthen programs for internal LEPs, such as codling moth, and help with resistance management when tank mixed with other LEP products. Zeal miticide offers long-lasting control to spotted spider mites and European red mites, working on all life stages of these pests, including eggs. Danitol is Valent's broad-spectrum insecticide that's effective on a wide range of tree fruit pests, including leafhoppers, rosy apple aphid, codling moth, brown marmorated stink bug, and more. Finally, a steam insect growth regulator is very efficient for the management of San Jose scale. A steam can be used at the crawler stage of this pest at 5 ounces per acre. It can also be used as part of your codling moth control program. More information about Valent products can be found at valent.com. With that, Terence, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with everybody again, and I think we've got some exciting things to talk about today as we look at this window of time between today and Monday or Tuesday for our 10 to 13 millimeter thinning spray. As you recall, we suggest the sequential series of steps to get crop load to a target fruit number. And right now we're in this window of the 10 to 13 millimeter spray. There's still another option about a week from now for spraying again if we can't get the job done now. However, some of the data that I've been looking at over the last 24 hours leads me to believe that I think this will be the last spray in most cases. As with always, your individual situation may vary, and we encourage you to try to make a very detailed assessment of each variety and each block before you come to the decision to stop thinning. Well, there's current fruit size in Western New York. I've been measuring fruits at the station. I've gotten measurements from Wayne County. I've gotten measurements from Orlean County. And overall, the largest kings are around 15 millimeters. They're growing about a millimeter a day. Most laterals are still in the 10 to 11 millimeters within the cluster. And there seems to be a significant and important size difference between the largest fruit in the cluster and the other laterals. One of the things that sometimes confuses people, and you might consider it a slight complication, is this year there was very substantial bloom on one-year wood. Those little flowers now have fruitlets, but their size is significantly smaller than the fruit from spurs. It's somewhere with the largest of those around 9 to 10 millimeters, but the laterals in those clusters from one-year wood are 5 to 6. Now, the fruit on that one-year wood is very susceptible to thinners that we might apply in the next few days. So where you need to get rid of that fruit, this is a great opportunity for getting rid of that fruit. There may be some situations, and probably more than some, where there was significant frost damage and you need fruit from some of the flowers on one-year wood, and so thinning it aggressively now will take off almost all of those. So that's a decision that you'll have to make. But nevertheless, the overall conclusion is that we're right now in one of the optimum windows to thin. When we look at options for thinning at this timing, they're basically combinations. We really settle down to one of two options, NaN7 or Maxellin-7. For most varieties, I think the Maxellin-7 is a better option at this timing. The exception is Honeycrisp, where we need the NAA in there to help stimulate return bloom. There may be some of you who are participating in marketing programs that prohibit the use of Carbaryl or 7. If that's your situation, we recommend the combination of Maxellin and NAA at this timing. We've tested it for at least 6 years on a whole range of varieties. And it tends to work quite well, with the exception of Fuji, where we can get pygmy fruit, and Red Delicious, where we get pygmy fruit. But for Gala, Mac, Honeycrisp, it has worked very, very well. So we end up with sort of a full dose of Maxell and 7.5 parts per million of NA, or 3 ounces. I will hasten to add that if we need more thinning a week from now, that adding some oil to the Maxell spray has been very successful for us. I'll comment briefly now, because I don't know if we'll have another meeting, that NAA loses its effectiveness as the average fruit size passes 15 millimeters. And so it really does not work very well when fruits are 18 millimeters. If we put oil with it, we get some thinning, but not a lot. We've also tested a number of years erythritol oil, and it has not been that effective. We have had some bad luck if the weather turned warm above 80 degrees and we got excessive thinning. But in most years where it's either high 70s or mid 70s, we don't get the proper thinning out of that erythritol oil. After looking at a lot of the data in the last 24 hours, I don't think many people are going to need that large fruit size spray. And so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. I'd be happy to answer specific questions you may have at the end about that. So our suggestions for this timing of spraying in the 12 millimeter is to really rely on the carbohydrate model to try to avoid overthinning. Very easy to use. You can download it to your phone and look at it in 15 seconds. Our suggestion is if carbohydrate deficits are minus 60 or less, don't spray at all. That gives you some natural thinning. Now, in the Hudson Valley this year, we had the heat wave hit right when they were in the same window we are now here in Western New York at the 12 millimeter stage. And I told them at the time they were experiencing a natural thinning event. And it's turned out to be exactly that. That heat wave did cause a lot of thinning, and then many blocks turned out really nice without much additional thinning. We're not facing the same thing here in Western New York, but if by chance we were to get some unexpected heat, you'd want to avoid spraying when you have minus 60 or less. I also suggest that you use the degree day calculator, which is in the carbohydrate model, and try to time your 12 millimeter sprays between 200 and 250. I next show the carbohydrate balance curve for Williamson as of about an hour ago. You'll notice that there's been no time during the entire season since green tip when we've had a 7-day average positive carbohydrate balance. This is a little unusual. We got close to a positive carbohydrate average balance around May 10th and 11th. Then we entered into this prolonged and persistent negative period that peaked in the negative carbohydrate level on May 25th and May 26th, right in the heat. I've seen some evidence the people that sprayed during that period got a lot of thinning and maybe over thinning. Since that weekend of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it cooled down on Saturday, but the 7-day average is still low, but it's moderated somewhat. And as we get to the day, it's only a moderate deficit, which is pretty nice to have that because it's going to help us get the thinning we need. I'd like to study just briefly with you some of the specifics of the daily carbohydrate balance that we see in this table. First, I included a few days starting on May 27th, 28th, 29th. Those were degrees in the 80s with nighttime temperatures in the 60s, particularly May 28th had a very high nighttime temperature and relatively low light level because of clouds, giving deficits of a daily of minus 99 and then the 29th of a minus 100. Those are really substantial deficits and they will cause some thinning. You need 2 to 3 days of that to get natural fruit drop, but I think that between the 27th, the 28th, and the 29th, we have induced quite a bit of natural fruit drop that we wouldn't have had we not had the heat, regardless of what we did chemically thinning. You'll see that at the time, on the last number column, that heat hit right at the petal fall timing be around 100 degree days. And that's when we would target petal fall thinning sprays. At that time, the tree is a little more resistant to carbohydrate deficits because the fruits are so small, they don't require much carbohydrates. If that same deficits would have hit us now, when fruits are 12 to 15 millimeters and they demand a lot of carbon every day, we would have dropped naturally 60% of our apples just because the tree cannot support them. And that high nighttime temperatures, high daytime temperatures, and low light. And if we would have had that stress at this moment in time when the fruits are bigger, the last column of recommendations would have been red, so do not thin. Now, at that time, when we had the heat stress, the model does not recommend not to thin because it's so early. The fruit's 5 to 6 millimeters, they're small and not demanding much carbon. But let's move forward now to the highlighted green date of today, predicted to be 80 in Williamson, high of 61 tonight, medium to high light, and a pretty substantial daily carbohydrate deficit of minus 77. But when you put that into a 7-day average, 2 days before and then 4 days after, you get sort of a medium carbohydrate deficit. I want you to note that in the last numeric column, we're in this window between 200 and 250, painted green, light green, indicating those are the optimum days to thin. So today, Friday, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday are all within that 200, 250 degree day window and will be great days to thin. We can manage it a little bit just looking at this 7-day carbohydrate average. Moderate deficits, they get a little bit less as we move forward. And tomorrow when you run the model and you'll see the predicted 7-day average for the 8th of June, you'll see that it's going to be even less because it'll have moderate deficits and then these, minus 20s, minus 30s. All in all, it tells us that it's really a great window to thin. We don't have great risk of over-thinning, but what we do have is the complication of frost and then heat-induced drop from the petal fall heat. And so it requires a very careful assessment of where you are in your block before you make the decision to thin. So I'm going to spend a little time on this slide with some of my suggestions, and you can go ahead and read ahead and study while I just ramble for a minute. I think it's essential that you look at each block, and I can't do that. But what I have done is been able to get data from a few blocks. And overall, it's looking like that there have been some overthinning on some blocks of Honeycrisp. Most Gala blocks still have too many fruits, but they're not loaded to the gills like in other years. I've gotten some data from other varieties that look also like the thinning was not too far off. We've got maybe double the number of fruits. I suppose your target number of fruits was 100. They have about 200 or 220. And that gets into the little bit of a personal choice. If you are afraid of thinning when you have a number of fruits growing that's not that much greater than the target, I can understand if you would be conservative and just say, I'll touch it up with hand thinning. But I think that if you've got at least double the number of fruits that you need, you're justified to put on another spray during this window when we have nice temperatures and some deficit, and we'll get the proper amount of thinning. So now let me go through this slide. To repeat, I think we're at the optimum window between today and next Monday. Anytime. There's good daytime temperatures and moderate nighttime temperatures with a moderately significant carbohydrate deficit. Thus, thinning is expected to be good. But I think there's little chance of overthinning. There is a little chance of overthinning if you spray today, but less risk later in this 4-day period. Now, I'm going to divide my recommendations into 2 sections. If you need substantial thinning, then I suggest a full dose. This is for Gala, for Snapdragon, for Empire, and Red Delicious. And the full dose is 64 ounces of Maxell and a pint of 7. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes on this recommendation because whenever I give recommendations, they are, as I put here in the text, on a dilute tree roll volume equivalent basis. So what does that mean? My dose of 64 ounces of Maxell is per 100 gallons dilute spray. Now, a mature tall spindle that hasn't been hedged, it's basically 12 feet tall, about 5 or 6 feet wide, it'll measure out at a dilute tree roll volume to 200. So my recommendation is for every 100, and you got 2 of those. So you have to multiply the 64 ounces by 2, which is the concentration factor, and that gives you 128 ounces or 1 gallon per acre. Now I'll stop there for just a minute and mention that the 2 hormone thinners primarily, well, amide also as well, 3, NAA, amide thin, and Maxell, they need the concentration factor built in to get the proper micrograms of chemical on the tree. And I'm a proponent of tree roll volume. It's turning out that tall spindle orchards that are hedged are measuring closer to 150. And some that are younger might be 130. So let's just use the 150 tree roll volume to discuss how it compares to the 200. I already calculated that if your orchard is a 200-gallon orchard, then you need a full gallon of Maxell. But if you've hedged and you have a thin, narrow wall, and it measures out to only 150 gallons, that means you only need 64 ounces times 1.5, which would give you 96 ounces of Maxell. And we do the same with the NAA. Now let's discuss briefly the 7 amount to go in the tank. I've said repeatedly every year that only about 1 pint of 7 is soluble in the water. If you put 2 pints per 100, which you would do if you concentrated 7, the second pint is just in suspension, it's not in solution, and when it lands on the leaf, it's deposited as a layer of pesticide, but it doesn't thin unless it's absorbed, and only that in solution can be absorbed. So you can't really overdose 7. Very safe in that way. But also that extra 7, if you double the rate and put it in the tank, it's sitting on the leaf and it lasts for about 7 days. And any re-wetting events during that 7 days will result in more uptake of 7 and more thinning. Now, people that have really heavy sets often will rely on that, and they'll put the 2 pints per 100 in there and just hope they get a little bit of rain on it or a little bit of moisture to make it more taken up in the plant. I think this year that's a mistake. The frost, the heat-induced thinning that we've gone through leave us with a number of unsettling feelings about needing a lot of thinning. We need thinning, but not as much as if it was just everything was set. So my suggestion is to concentrate the rate for Maxell or NAA, but not for 7. So going on in the chart of or table of my suggestions for Honeycrisp, I specifically like the NAA because we need that for inducing return bloom, and a fairly substantial amount of NA, 3 ounces per 100 on a dilute tree row volume equivalent basis. So that means for a 200-gallon tall spindle orchard, you'd be putting on 6 ounces of NA to the acre with 1 pint of 7 per acre. Now, there are many other varieties that are easier thin. They include McIntosh and Ida Red, big in Western New York. They require a lower dose of 2 ounces of NA per 100 gallons dilute and 1 pint of 7 per 100 gallons. Thus, they would get, if it was a mature tall spindle orchard of Ida Red, they get 4 ounces of NA per acre and a pint of 7. I'm going to continue that table with the second half of it on the next slide, which basically is what to do if you don't need aggressive thinning. If you're fairly close on your target, and I would say that you're 100 apples over your target or less, I still think you'll get some benefit from thinning, but at more moderate doses. So for Gala, Snapdragon, Empire, Red Delicious, a partial dose would be 48 ounces of Maxell, which on a tree row volume tall spindle of 200 gallons, it would be the 96 ounces, 3/4 of a gallon to the acre, and a pint of 7. For Honeycrisp that have more apples than you want, but not a huge excess, I still think we should spray them, but with a lower dose of 2 ounces per 100, which would be 4 ounces to the acre. For easy to thin varieties where maybe you lost the kings and you're depending on the crop of laterals and you don't need that much thinning, just a low dose of NAA, 1 ounce per 100, which is 2 ounces to the acre, and a pint of 7 will do a good job. Now, one of the reasons why I think even where you're fairly close on your target number that you should thin is because of all the fruit on bloom from 1-year wood. Snapdragon in particular, it just blooms like crazy on 1-year wood, and all that fruit's there. And if you didn't have enough spur fruit, you depend on fruit on 1-year wood. But if you had plenty of spur flowers and you've thinned that well and you're close on your target, primary or the objective would be to get rid of all the fruit from bloom on 1-year wood. And that's what you'll get done with these kinds of applications, even though you're fairly close to the target fruit number. Some other suggestions that I would make for this spray, where there has been frost damage, shut off half of the nozzles on the lower half of your bank of your spray. Apply no thinner to the bottom half of the tree. But even where there's been little frost damage, we get better uniformity if we shut off the lower third of the nozzles. So if your bank has 10 nozzles, shut off the bottom 3. If it has 9, shut off the bottom 3. And then lastly, I don't think it's a year to use surfactants like regulator oil, just because many blocks had some damage, and where you don't have kings, the laterals thin easier. And it's just an additional variable that I don't think we need this year. So with that, let me try to address some of the questions right now.
Sure. We had some hail damage here 2 days ago, not too severe, but I'm wondering how hail damage to leaves interacts with NAA thinning since both produce some ethylene. I put Carbol 4L in with some strep after the hailstorm Tuesday morning.
So you're correct that hail damage induces some ethylene in the damaged fruits. But our experiences have been it would be nice to thin all those off, but we just can't thin them off without thinning off healthy fruit too. So it's an unfortunate situation that they do have some ethylene, but I guess not enough to induce the drop that you would like. So where we had that kind of mild hail damage, I think you've got to thin like you would if there was no hail damage. The application of the 4L7 will help, but it probably won't be enough. Now, if it went on with this heat, it depends a little bit also if in that strep spray you put Regulade. The Regulade acts to get more 7 in, and so you get more thinning. Sounds to me like it was a pretty good strategy where you need some thinning. I might have put a little bit of NAA in the mix, assuming we really need some thinning. But it's going to be hard to see the response from that if you sprayed it yesterday, at least for another few days. And so this is a situation where measuring fruit diameters about 2 days from now and then 7 days from now would really help you judge what's happened. And then you still have a last opportunity to put some more thinner on late next week.
Thank you, Terence. The degree day calculator, for folks who know where it is on the newer website, the menu is crop load management. Can you, which temperature for them to choose again, Terence?
Don't go to any of those that let you choose temperatures. Those are all those things are developed by entomologists and pathologists, and they talk about different temperatures. The only place to find the degree day calculator that we use for thinning is in the carbohydrate thinning model version 2019. It's under crop load management menu on NUA, and then you have to pick a weather station and enter your green tip and bloom date and run it. And it'll tell you on that last column of the carbohydrate model, the accumulated degree days base 38. Now, there's no other place on NUA where the base 38 is listed.
Thank you, Terence, because it is confusing because it's under the crop load management submenu, the degree day calculator.
And this is a problem. I hope that I can figure out a better solution for it. I will admit that I don't even like the degree day model because it's a linear model, and I, along with Alan and a few scientists around the world, are trying to develop a different way to calculate the heat accumulation. And we were going to get that done this year until coronavirus didn't let anybody come. We had it all planned out. Craig was going to be a part of it too. But I hope that in a year from now, we are going to have a different heat unit accumulator, and I'm going to call it heat units. And we'll tell you how many heat units are the optimum version. We won't even use the word degree day because of that confusing with other degree day calculators.
Sounds good. Thank you. The question was, isn't that 1 quart per acre 7 on 200-gallon trees?
Yes. My suggestion is 1 pint per 100. And so if you follow the logic that I gave for Maxell and NAA of concentrating it or doubling it for a 200-gallon orchard, yes. But still, we're not spraying 200 gallons. If you were truly spraying 200 gallons and you put 2 pints in or 1 quart, then each of those pints would be in solution because you have 200 gallons of water. But I should have made that clear. Almost nobody is spraying 200 gallons. It's just too many times to go fill up. So we suggest, and this is stuff that I should think to say but often forget because we've said it in the past, we suggest that you not haul extra water. You concentrate this thinning sprays at least 2x, meaning that if your orchard calls for 200 gallons, spray only 100. But we're also comfortable with a 3x, which means if your orchard calls for 200, dilute, a 3x spray would only be about 67 gallons. So somewhere between the 2x and the 3x is our preferred concentration level. For most tall spindles, that could be as little as 67 gallons or as much as 100. And then adjust up the Maxell, or if you're spraying NAA, the NAA rate. But since you're only spraying 67 gallons or 100 gallons, the amount of 7 you get is only what's in solution. And so adding extra 7 does nothing for thinning that day. It deposits that extra 7 as a layer of insecticide on the leaf. And then it helps you if you get really wetting. And in some years when the fruit load is really heavy, I want that extra, hope for that extra re-wetting. It's unpredictable because you got to get a little moisture on there. But I don't think this is the year to do that. So I would just leave it at, if you have a 500-gallon sprayer, no matter what volume, no matter what you're doing, just add 5 pints of 7 4L or XLR.
Thank you, Terence. Question about the carbohydrate model. Why did you change to 7-day average, just forwards?
The 18-year study we did indicates that the 2 days before thinning have an influence on the thinning response. So that gave us the best correlations over 18 years to the response we got from the thinners. I have some improvements I'm going to make for 2020. I'm not going to announce them yet, but it will be a modified formula for calculating that 7-day average. For this year, if you don't like that 7-day average and you run the model, you can easily by hand calculate your own average of the day of spraying, which it used to be, and 4 days more. So it used to be a 5-day average. So it's not that complicated. I would just encourage you to do what you feel best with, either just looking at today plus 4 more days or looking back 2 days as well, which the model will do for you. And I hope to have even a better version of that in 2020.
Thank you. What will 1 quart of ethyl do with 2 ounces of NAA on Honeycrisp?
I don't know. I've never tried that. I predict it'll smoke them. But that's another little issue that I don't have the data to talk about, because we've done generally 1 pint of ethyl. And our rates of 1 pint have typically been moderate thinning unless we get temperatures above 85 degrees. Then it's really hot mixture. But in terms of repeat bloom, there is some incentive to try to use ethyl. Over the years, our studies with ethyl, which start at 25 millimeters versus NAA, indicate that ethyl is more effective at inducing repeat bloom. So you could logically argue, well, if that's the case, we could put ethyl on right now, earlier, at the 10, 15, 18 millimeters, based upon the work Pollyanna did, which showed flower initiation on Honeycrisp is early. So the earlier you can get these ethyl and NAAs on, or the combination, will be even better. I've not done the ethyl work at this timing. We're doing it this year. In fact, we're spraying today in 80-degree heat to try to look at that at Geneva. But I don't want to recommend it to you. I think it would be a fairly hot mixture and like over thin, especially since I've already seen some over thinning on Honeycrisp around Western New York.
Thanks, Terence. 1 more for now. Says, I have 2 to 4 side fruit on Ida Red. Should I use the 1 ounce, 1 pint rate?
Well, let's just talk about both cases. So if the kings were present, you still had 2 to 4, I'd put on the full rate, 5 parts per million, which is 2 ounces, and concentrate based on tree size. If you had the kings mostly gone, say 70 to 80% of the kings gone, I would lower that to the 1 ounce per 100, or basically 2 ounces per acre plus the pint of 7.
That answers my question. Thank you.
I only have 1 more slide, and it's just a plea. How are we going to know whether these sprays we're going to spray today or tomorrow or Sunday or Monday do a good job? This fruit growth rate measurements is so helpful. I would encourage you to measure fruitlets, load the data, website malusim.org. If you send me your username and password, I can look at it. It's turning out this is the easiest way for me to handle data. I have a lot of confidence in the MaluSim version of the fruit growth rate model. It automatically sorts the data. So I just was working with a person earlier today who had measured a number of blocks and calculated it using the old spreadsheet method, but didn't sort it properly. And the model was telling that there are a lot more fruits were dropping than what really are. When we did it the right way, it showed that that person needs substantial thinning. And that person was thinking, no, I'm pretty much done. The opposite is also true, and that's my big plea. And I'll tell this story that happened to us this year in the Hudson Valley. They're ahead of us. And so at the heat wave, everybody was just really uptight because it was at the 12 millimeter stage. And we worked through that. I told them to avoid spraying in the heat, wait it out, spray after. And then people said, well, now what? Do we still need to thin again at the 18 millimeter? That's coming up. And we got a number of people to measure fruitlets. And wow, the heat plus the thinner they did after the heat basically thinned everything down to exactly the target load, or maybe a few fruits extra. Very few that were below the target. But without that data, they would have all gone back out there at 18 millimeters and sprayed again and taken more fruit off and cost themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars on every farm. So the effort they made to measure fruit saved them from putting on that 4th spray at 18 millimeters and over thinning. And that's really the value of the fruit growth rate model. based upon the data that I've seen so far from different places around Orleans and Wayne County, I think that this is the last spray. Some people already don't need this last spray. Some blocks that have overthinned, particularly some Honeycrisp blocks. But for most Gala blocks that I've seen, and for others that we have a little bit of data, this is the last spray. Go forward with the kind of suggestions. If you see that you need a lot, go with a full rate. It's not too risky. The deficits are not bad. If you had some damage and frosts and you want to be a little more conservative, go with my lower rates. But this is the time to thin again, and then I think we'll be done.
How does severe hail damage, i.e. almost every apple hit, affect thinning?
So when the damage is severe, there is more ethylene, and if you combine NAA right on top of that, you can thin off a lot. The bad part is you don't always thin off the hail damaged fruit. And we've tried that a number of times, and they're not very good at getting the damaged ones off. They seem to persist. So I've often discounted the hail damage on thinning response unless the hail damage is severe. Now, the earlier question indicated light damage, and I don't think light damage will really impact the thinning response. This question, with heavy damage, it probably will impact the thinning response. And you should probably use the more moderate conservative rates that I listed on the earlier slide.
Does Maxell perform at different temperatures the day of application, i.e. 65 degrees versus mid-70s or possibly higher?
So Maxell is responsive to temperature, but not just on the day of application. It takes the first day to be absorbed. So suppose you sprayed today in the 80s. It will be absorbed, but its metabolic effect works not only today, but the next day and for the next 4 days at least. So 1 day of heat won't dramatically change the Maxell response. But if you had back-to-back 2 days, 3 days of heat, then you get substantially greater response out of Maxell. That's why I have this average of the carbohydrate balance over 7 days, so that you don't get too focused on just 1 day's number of carbohydrate balance. But our shading studies, where we artificially induce a carbohydrate deficit by shading, shows that 1 day of shading doesn't do anything. The trees seem to be able to compensate. So one bad carbohydrate day won't thin fruit, but 2 to 3 days, especially 3 days consecutive, will thin just by shading. And that's the same with the thinner. So 2 to 3 days of deficit will really help you get the fruit off with the chemical thinners. I'd just add one other thing. It is well established that Maxell works better under warm conditions. But when we sprayed over 18 years, every 3 days, regardless of the temperature, we had years where it was always cool when we sprayed Maxell and always warm. And that temperature response isn't as important as I was thinking before. Certainly, when the temperatures are below 60, it doesn't work very well. But if it's 70, if it's 80, it kind of will give similar response if you're in this window of 200 to 250 degree days. That's when it's most effective.
Thank you, Terence. Somebody running the carbohydrate model in Orleans County, and it says increased thinner 30%. Are we sure?
I have to look at which weather station they used, and because I'd have to look at it. The table, I don't think, makes mistakes. It's simply a lookup table that has for every different situation what those words should say. I'm the author of that table. So if it says to increase thinners, it's looking back 2 days and looking forward today and forward 4 more days, and then looking at what that average is and basing that recommendation on that average.
Thank you. And one more follow-up, effect of nighttime spraying for thinning?
We don't think it has a huge effect, and I'll explain. We did some studies where we sprayed very early in the morning, noon, when it's hot, late evening, and evening. And these were studies done with Ed Stover and myself back when he was in the Hudson Valley, and I forget the year, maybe around the year 2000. We tended to get the same response, regardless of the time of day. We interpreted the data this way. If you spray at night, temperatures are cooler, but the drying is slower. So the chemical goes into the leaf at a slow rate, but over a longer period of time. It's the opposite in the middle of the day when it's hot. In heat, the rate of uptake is really fast, but it also dries fast. And so the time for uptake is less. But the total chemical that gets in probably is similar. And it's the amount of chemical in the leaf that causes the metabolic reactions and responses. So we don't think it has a huge impact on thinning response.
Really appreciate the information, Terence, and fielding all the questions.
I hadn't heard about the hail damage. That always makes me sad. I hate for anybody to get hail.
Yeah, I mean, I'm outside of that. I'm in Grand Island, north of Buffalo, and Tuesday night, was it? About 11 o'clock, we had a cell that was ridiculous. And I have damage on my fleet car. I have about 50 dings on my fleet car. It did not chip the paint. But I looked at that moved across, and it looked like it skirted around Niagara and Orleans. And to me, that wave that moved through 11:30, it didn't look like it hit too many apple orchards, and I haven't heard too much. It went down into the southern tier, southeast of Buffalo, and like Chautauqua, Cattaraugus counties. The band was huge. Haven't heard much.
Wow. Mario, would you just talk briefly about what you're seeing with your eyes out there?
Yeah, I think so. Perhaps I am still very kind of confused about the ATS applications that we did. Definitely ATS helped it a lot. Anytime that we left a section without ATS and we just spray the petal falls, it's very obvious to see the difference and the effect of ATS. But I don't know why we couldn't see the same, perhaps, efficiency that we saw last year when I used it for the first time with growers, kind of in commercial side, when Terence kind of encouraged us to go to the field to use it at 60%. So this year we went with that kind of set of mind. And even I had a grower that we visited yesterday with a 3% ATS. Wasn't too bad at the end, even though the grower was so concerned about overthinning honeycrisp and Gala. So I have an idea, Terence, that perhaps honeycrisp is a little more sensitive to ATS, to the blossom thinning. I didn't see the same issue that I saw with New York 1 last year with ATS, with the Phyto, that I thought last year that New York 1 was even more sensitive to ATS. I see the need to figure out this ATS kind of soon. If we could have even a discussion about all the blossom thinning effort that we had this year with the growers, before we forget what we learned, could be great to bring the grower who use ATS. I have growers who use ATS even in Smitten. That is gonna be perhaps another one in the future that we're gonna have to treat during bloom. I see so the thinning have been the most difficult thinning that I have seen from the point of view that is very kind of erratical. Has sites that haven't, with honeycrisp, I had sites that didn't receive a blossom thinning, didn't receive a petal fall. We measured yesterday. We're gonna come back to measure those sites on Monday, and perhaps it's not gonna be needed thinning spray just because whatever was the cold damage made their job, that particular site, under those situations. So we had the good, the bad, and the ugly all over. It's good that growers submitted data so Terence can see the behavior of those blocks. I really think I have a Gala block that I'm waiting to hear, but I think so we are done with another Gala block, just with the blossom program and the petal fall and a little bit of thinning perhaps at the top. But I think so, Terence, you're super right. I think so we're gonna be done with the thinning after this weekend or by Monday. But definitely we had to continue measuring, and wasn't so bad like we saw from the get-go with the cold damage and everything. I think so the need of thinning was always there, even with a block that have a 15, 20, 30%. The separation was, yesterday was great, was working. Yesterday was a Maxell day. I have Maxell growers that were spraying. Today is another beautiful also day. The deficit is right there, so I don't think so we're gonna overthink. Those are my comments.
Well, let me add to those just a little bit. I think that we have to remember that this year brought several not common issues. The frost, but then that amount of heat that we had at the petal fall timing is a natural thinning event. So if there's over thinning, it's really going to be a challenge to tease out what caused the over thinning. I'm leaning that it's partially responsible to applying NAA and 7 at Petal during the heat. So if a person applied during that really heat wave, I think you got tremendous thinning. We'll work on at Geneva, we have the controlled experiments where we have ATS only. That's the only thing we put on versus ATS plus NA and 7 during the heat. And so we'll be able to decipher whether the overthinning that we saw in a couple of blocks was due to the ATS or it was due to the Petal NA and 7 put on during heat. So I just want to caution Mario to not jump to the conclusion that there's an ATS problem. Now, a second point is I wanted to comment on a question Roger Bannister posed in the Q&A. He's measuring fruitlets and he's not scheduled to re-register until tomorrow, but he's already getting out of the window of the degree days. This has happened a number of times, and what I've told people is go ahead and measure today. It's not that big a deal. You'll at least get a very good estimate of where you're at in order to make decisions for thinning tomorrow or maybe even tonight. But if you wait and then you get too far beyond the window of optimum thinning, you won't get much thinning unless you add some oil to the mix. But I want to wait on any decisions about adding oil until next week and we see what kind of thinning we got from sprays put on today or yesterday or tomorrow. So go ahead and measure a day early, look at the data, and then make your decision.
So Terence, perhaps if we have another situation like we had during the Memorial Day weekend, imagine if we have been kind of talking to grow about ATA, but in some moment we had to switch and go for an NAA recommendation to know that how we can get to that point, that could be beneficial because we had to become the master of ATS at Bloom, but we need to know how to react if something like this happen again.
Yeah, but I don't think that you're justified in any of that conclusion yet, Mario. We have to look at the data. It's likely that the real problem was the heat at Petal, not the heat at Bloom. The heat at Petal created these -100 deficits, which were really unusual.
Okay. Yeah, we got to learn. We got to learn the thing.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Seeing no more questions, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Wiltberger, our business management specialist. He has a special announcement about a webinar that he's organizing, COVID-19 workers.
Thank you. I'm going to post the information with the link at the end of it in the chat. Yeah, so it's just 1 hour on Tuesday online. Managing field crews during COVID-19, what actions should apple growers take? And it's based on best practices from Cornell, the guidance that just came out last week, and also just the general framework that the New York State is asking for all businesses to have a plan. And the emphasis is going to be on that this is not that intimidating. This is not a FSMA plan. This does not need to be submitted. This is not going to be inspected. It's just a way to come up with a plan or use your own plan that you already have and make sure that it fulfills some other things that they could contact trace if they needed to, things like that. And on the panel will be David Bell, who's the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for Genesee and Orleans County, and he's been trying to reach out a lot to Orleans County growers. Rich Stupp from Cornell Ag Workforce Development, Betsy Bin from Food Safety at Cornell, and myself. And it'll just be an hour. So that link will be online. It's also on the Fruit Notes email.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank Terence, Mario, Mark, and Liz and Janet for helping us organize this webinar. I think despite us being grounded with COVID, they've been pretty successful. You folks know how to get a hold of us if there's any further questions. Again, thanks again to Valent Biosciences and Valent USA for their sponsorship. And everybody have a good day.